The gospel reading for this morning was from the Gospel of Matthew. It tells the story of the transfiguration that Peter refers back to in his letter. I remind you, in the Matthew version, it says 6 days later, after whatever happened 6 days before, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain, and he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared Moses and Elijah talking with him. How he knew it was Moses and Elijah, we don't know. He didn't have trading cards. I don't know how he recognized them, but it says that was Moses and Elijah. And then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Now at this point, Mark, in his telling of it, says, Peter said that because he didn't know what else to say. He was just riffing. He was just going, yeah, I don't know what I'm talking about. Since Mark was written first, I wouldn't say that Mark added that. I would say that Matthew, gracious to Peter, left that part out. He didn't say, well, cut Peter some slack. Let's don't point out that he didn't know what he was just babbling up there. So he says, it's good for us to be here. And while they were still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. And a voice from the cloud said, this is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. Listen to him. Matthew tells the story as one who wasn't there. It was Peter and James and John. Matthew wasn't there. He had to overhear the story. He could only tell it because he had heard it before. But what Jesus says to them on the way down the mountain is, get up, don't be afraid. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, tell no one about this vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Wait, what? We're just getting over this thing, and now you're telling us you're going to be raised from the dead. Actually, Jesus told them that several times, but they never got it. Matthew also didn't put that part in, that they didn't get it. But they didn't get it. Peter didn't mind telling you, I didn't get it. The great thing about the Bible is all the disciples who recorded their stories in the Gospels are free to admit, we didn't know what he was talking about half the time. But we just kept following him. And then after a while, the light would come on. And then we figured it out. We didn't figure it out until after he was raised from the dead that he really meant he was going to be raised from the dead. That wasn't some sort of a parable he was telling. He really meant it. But Jesus said, after that happens, then you're free to tell the story because then you'll understand. And apparently, after he was raised, they did tell it so that Matthew and Mark and other Gospels could tell the story. According to Luke chapter 18, after Jesus tells them for a third time that he's going to be raised from the dead, Luke puts in, they understood nothing, the saying was hidden from them, they did not grasp it at all. He tells you 3 different ways they didn't get it. God had said, listen to him, but they didn't understand what he said. They heard, but they were clueless. But then, everything he predicted happened. And after he was raised, they did understand. And then they told everybody. Everybody that would give them a minute, they told. Because once you know the story, you want to share it. I mean, what happened up on the mountain, that was a wild scene, but it's nothing compared to the resurrection. Some people doubt doubt the Bible because it says crazy things like Jesus was born of a virgin. That's not how people are born. They didn't understand. Well, they understood plenty. They knew it was a miracle that he was born of a virgin. Do I believe he was born of a virgin? I'm willing to. I don't need for Jesus to be born of a virgin for him to be my Lord. But once I accept that he was raised from the dead, nothing else seems improbable. I can accept that. God does things that are incomprehensible to man, but when he does them and you see them, you understand at least that it happened, if not how, and you want to tell the story. So Peter and the Thunder brothers, that's what Jesus called James and John, the sons of thunder, they told what happened. Honest about their own misunderstanding. We didn't get it, they said. It's a common refrain. He says, the stuff we've seen, the stuff we've heard, it'd curl your toes, man. You'd be struck dumb too. It's so easy for us on this side of Easter to look at Jesus on the other side of Easter and say, yep, all that's leading up to the crucifixion and the resurrection because we know the whole story. But those that hadn't experienced it yet, it must have been very strange indeed. Like people who don't have children telling parents who do have children how to raise them. You hadn't been there. We made that mistake with our first one. He was so easy, we thought we had this parenting thing down. We told other people, oh, it's just child raising is easy. And then our second son informed us, no, you got lucky the first time. You don't know till you've seen it. You don't know till you've been there. But once you've seen it, once you've been there, then you can speak with some authority. But still, it's hard for many. They ask, how can we believe all of that? And they will try to argue you with logic why you shouldn't, or at least why they can't. And so Peter speaks for himself in this letter. We didn't follow cleverly devised myths, he said. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Now, I imagine that Peter was always a little embarrassed by his country bumpkin status. I mean, Peter was a country boy. He was raised up there in Galilee, not Nazareth, thank goodness, but Capernaum might as well be the county seat of nowhere you've ever been to or wanted to go. Down in Jerusalem, that was north. Yeah, that was country bumpkins up there. You see, you speak with a Galilean accent like that was bad. Like people talk about Southerners like that's bad. It's a good accent. He says, I'm just a simple man. I wasn't educated. He must feel a little shy in the presence of Paul. Paul would always proudly proclaim how he was a Roman citizen born in Tarsus, educated by the greatest of the rabbis. Oh, he had everything, all that. And in Paul's presence, I'm sure Peter always felt like, oh, nobody's going to listen to me. I'm just a fisherman, just a blue-collar worker. Out on the boat, no collar at all, just bare-chested, me in the wind and the water and pulling those nets in. I'm just a worker for a living. And so how's anybody going to pay attention to me? He says, we didn't follow cleverly devised myths like all of those well-educated people who want to rationalize and put it all together. He didn't have a systematic theology. He didn't have a very deep theology at all. But what he had better was a theophany. A theophany, that's one of those big seminary words that I learned when I became so well-educated. Theophany means a vision, an experience, a presence of God. When Isaiah was in the temple and he saw God on the throne, he said, whoa, that was a theophany, an experience of the presence of God. What Moses got up on the mountain, and now what Peter and James and John got up on the mountain, the presence of God. I heard the voice from heaven. I saw Jesus shine bright. Wow, I may not have a deep theology, but I know what I saw. No theology can beat a good theophany, a vision of God. Paul, on the other hand, probably always felt bad in the presence of the other disciples because he constantly refers to be as one is born at an untimely time. He never got to see Jesus in Jesus' life. It was only after his death. But he had a theophany there on the road to Damascus. Well, not a vision, because he had his vision taken away, but he had an audition, I guess. He heard God, heard Jesus speak. And after that, he said, all right, now I wasn't one of the early ones. I wasn't one of the first disciples, but I'm an apostle just like everybody else. Everybody always feels bad about their own testimony, like something's missing. Somebody else can say it better. Somebody else has more authority because they were there. Somebody else has more authority because they got a good education. Nobody's story beats your story because your story is your story. And nobody else has your experience of God. If you can't preach like Peter, if you can't pray like Paul, says the old hymn, just tell the love of Jesus and say he died for all. That's all you really need. Now, after Peter describes his vision up there on the mountaintop, when we heard that voice, when we were up there, we heard that voice and saw that thing that happened, he says, you will do well to be attentive to this as a lamp shining in a dark place. You ought to pay attention, Peter says. Even if that's not your story, you ought to be paying attention to my story because my story is my story and I know it and I'm telling it, and you should listen to me because until you have your own theophany, you have to trust in other people's. So you find people whose faith is evident. You find people whose story is true because you know it's true because they're living it every day, and you say, I haven't had my Jesus moment on the mountain yet, but I trust these people who have because I trust them and I've seen their lives and I know their faith is true. He says, it's like a lamp shining in a dark place. I read just recently about a fellow who went and spent some time at a monastery and went to morning and evening prayers in the dark, lit by luminaria. Luminaria, those paper bags with candles in them. He said there were other paths he could have taken, but he would have tripped and fallen because it was dark. The only path that he could safely walk was the one that was well lit by these little lights along the side of the road. Every Christian story you hear is another little light that helps you stay on the path until you find the bright light of Christ himself. Peter is saying, hey, if you don't have a story, tell mine. I give you permission. And that's what Matthew and Mark did in their Gospels. They said, this little light of mine, well, I'm going to let it shine. Let it shine till Jesus comes. And when Jesus becomes real in your life, you'll believe it and you'll see it. And then you'll start telling your own story. Have you seen Christ's glory? What did it look like? Was it a bright shining light? Was it a cloud on the mountain? I had a mountaintop experience in the cloud one time at Stone Mountain, Georgia. Stone Mountain, Georgia isn't a ridge of mountains. It's a single thumb of granite sticking up out of flat land. And so the weather doesn't kind of go over the mountains. It just surrounds the mountain and keeps moving. Me and my wife and kids were up there one hot summer day, and we were up on top of this mountain, and a cloud passed through it. And suddenly we were engulfed in a deep fog, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees, and it was cool and moist instead of hot and dry on that thumb of granite in the middle of summer. But we couldn't see anything, and I stood in place going, wait, where'd everybody go? And then just as quickly as it came, it passed, and suddenly the lights were back on, and I could see my kids and my wife, and we all had that same look. We were like 10, 15 feet apart from each other, but we were all looking at each other going, what was that? We had an experience. When you have an experience, and you find God in that experience, you do well to remember and tell that story. But maybe your story doesn't look like Peter's. Maybe your story isn't like Paul's. Maybe you can't preach like Peter or pray like Paul. You just have to tell your own story. And sometimes an epiphany, a theophany, an experience of God come alive in Jesus Christ is more subtle. Sometimes you see it in a marriage saved. Sometimes you see it in a child healed, an addiction cured, lives changed. A little voice says, pay attention. You would do well to be attentive to this. Pay attention. Figure it out. And then tell it. When you hear somebody else tell their story, what they saw, what gave them faith, what restored their life, you will do well to be attentive to this. Gathering their stories like little luminaria along your path until you yourself see the light. Hank Williams sang, I saw the light, I saw the light. No more darkness, no more night. Praise the Lord, I saw the light. When you see your own light, then your light becomes one of those little luminaria that can help others find their way to Christ. If you tell it, if you light your light, if you let it burn. Peter, James, and John, it took them time to get it, but they held on the mystery until they did. And on that mountain, Jesus was brighter than ever, but Peter was as dim as ever. But they hung on. And like his mother Mary pondered these things in their hearts. What does all this mean? When they had their story to tell, they told it with such conviction that Matthew and Mark and others passed it on, and now we have received it too. Transfiguration is what happens when Jesus suddenly becomes living to you. When you suddenly see Jesus as not just a character in a story, not just a name written in a book, not just stories you've heard in Sunday school, but becomes real and alive in your lifetime, then Jesus has become transfigured in your life, then you can go out and transform the world. Transfiguration when God chooses to act, when God speaks, when honor and glory come to Christ in your lifetime and you become transformed by His transfiguration. Transforming the world is a little less showy business. It's just getting out there and telling the story and doing the things. It's what Jesus did in the valley after He came down the mountain. Healing a boy, feeding some people, going to a cross. If you have a story, you need to be telling it. If you don't have a story, you need to be listening hard to other people who do have stories. Because Christ hasn't come down 2,000 years in the stories of the people who believed and the people who believed and the people who believed before them. He hasn't come down all that way just because He's a character in a book. He's been made alive in people's lives and depends on your coming alive to Him and Him alive to you so that you can take your turn. Where have you seen Jesus shine? Was it a great light or a small light? Think of your story. Who will you tell? Who will retell it? Peter says in his letter, which was written before the Gospels, that voice we heard on the mountain, apparently he's told it before. He's referring back to it as to people who've already heard that story. He's heard that story, now he refers back to that story. And if I say the same things over and over again in a number of sermons, it's because my story is a certain set of stories, and I refer back to them because that's my story to tell. But man, I sure want to hear your stories. Compile your stories so that when you can tell them, you won't have to be ashamed because your story isn't like Peter's, your story isn't like Paul's. Your story is your story, and it's worth telling. And Christ is depending on you being one of those little lights so that His great light might continue to come into the world. I lost my bulletin. There it is. Our closing hymn. Our closing hymn is Ask Ye What Great Thing I Know. People won't always ask. You've got to be ready to tell them. But let's stand and sing about that great thing we know. Ask me what great thing I know that delights and stirs me so. What the high reward I win, whose the name I glory in, Jesus Christ the crucified, who defeats my fiercest foes, who consoles my saddest woes, who revives my fainting heart, healing all its hidden smart, Jesus Christ the crucified, who is life in life to me, who the death of death will be, who will place me on His right with the countless hosts of light, Jesus Christ the crucified. This is that great thing I know, this delights and stirs me so. Faith in Him who died to save, Him who triumphed o'er grave, Jesus Christ the crucified. Some lights to fire blowing out. If you have a light to shine, shine it into the world.
ruins.